So my sermon this morning is on Esther. And the thing that I really like about this book is that it's more than just another princess story. Growing up, it was one of my favourite stories, and there was something about the story of an ordinary girl who becomes a queen and saves God's people that really sparked my imagination. Now, the book of Esther has all the ingredients for an interesting story. It's got rags to riches, it's got drama, it's got intrigue, it has plot twists and danger and revenge and deliverance, but it's also one of those stories that is so well known that we don't really pay attention to it anymore. Yet as I read Esther's story again through older eyes, I gained a new understanding of her life, different to the glossed over version that I read and knew from my children's picture books. It showed me a time where God appeared to be silent, and yet it helped me to understand the role that faith can play in the lives of ordinary people. In order to understand a bit more of the historical and cultural context of her story, we'll briefly go back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, when the Israelites were first taken captive and exiled into Babylon. The Babylonians practiced a form of occupation where they deliberately displaced the inhabitants of any territory that they captured. This minimised the risk of any future uprisings, and it helped to create one homogenised culture across the entire empire. Therefore, whilst the Jewish people entered Babylonian captivity as a nation, by the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, they had begun to denationalise and emerge as a race or a church. In approximately 573 BC, a man named Zerubbabel led a return to Jerusalem along with about 50,000 Jews in order to rebuild the temple. However, and perhaps because of the denationalisation that occurred under the Babylonians, many of the Jewish exiles did not return to their homelands at this time and instead remained spread throughout the Medo-Persian Empire. The story of Esther is set about 60 years after this first wave of returnees, and it gives us a glimpse into the virtually hidden nature of the Jewish cultural identity at the time. So if you have your Bibles with you, follow along with me in Esther chapter 2. That's Esther chapter 2, and we will start at verse 5. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family had been amongst those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. Now, just as an aside, something that I found out during my research is that the name Mordecai actually means son of Marduk. Marduk was the Persian creator god who presided over heaven, light, sky, battle, and fertility. And according to Persian mythology, he killed a sea dragon named Tiamat, who was an enemy of the gods, and created the earth and sky from her body. Likewise, the name Esther, whilst commonly thought to mean the star, is also considered a derivative of Ishtar, who was the Babylonian goddess of love, war, and fertility. So just by looking at the meaning of their names, we already begin to see that Mordecai and Esther, as third-generation exiles, have assimilated into the culture in which they reside, despite their Jewish identity. As such, I believe the Esther that we observe is fully Persian, right down to the name that she is commonly known by. She is surrounded by the traditions and customs of Persian life. In other words, she lives a life disconnected from both her cultural identity and the open practice of her religious convictions. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 10, we read that Esther had not told anyone her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. So, whilst there's no record of precisely why Mordecai gave her this instruction, it indicates to me that Esther's faith in God appears to be quite separate from any form of open religious practice. Indeed, throughout the entire book of Esther, the name of God is never mentioned once. Now, as many of you would know, about this time King Xerxes, having banished his previous queen Vashti on account of embarrassing him in front of all of his courtiers and nobles, begins a new search for a queen. And let me tell you now, this is not exactly the beauty pageant as depicted in many of the children's versions that we know. Verse 8. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought before the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Heggai's care. Heggai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. We learn something of the character and attitude of Esther in these verses. We already know that she was beautiful in form and features, but evidently she also had a beautiful personality. One article I read suggested that as many as 400 attractive young women were brought into the harem from across the 127 provinces as a result of this decree. So for Heggai to respond to Esther in this way indicates to me that something other than her physical beauty was already setting her apart from the other girls. I believe it is likely that she was humble and kind, respectful, and behaved with integrity. Continuing on in verse 10. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. Before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months of special perfumes and ointments. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. That evening, she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem, where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. There was no returning home for failed candidates. The reality is that for any one of them to stand out, they would have had to have been something very special. And at this point in the story, Esther seems destined for life as a harem girl. But God has something else in mind for her. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Heggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested, and Esther won the favour of everyone who saw her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign, and the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honour for all of his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai was sitting at the gate of the king, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. Notice how Esther won the favour of every person with whom she came into contact. She did not employ manipulation, fear, or mere beauty to get what she wanted. If she had, her favour and position would never have lasted. Esther chose instead to use her brains. She exhibited humility and wisdom by listening to and following the advice of Heggai, the man who knew what the king found most attractive, rather than relying solely on her own understanding. And not only that, but even after successfully securing her place as the queen, she continued to respect and follow Mordecai's instructions. Yes, her beauty was absolutely a tool and benefit, but it was not all she had. In chapter 3, verse 1, we're introduced to Haman. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all of the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all of the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Haman's desire to destroy the Jewish population was not solely linked to Mordecai's refusal to bow down. Here we see a historic feud playing out between the Jews as descendants of Jacob and the Amalekites as descendants of Esau. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 7 to 9, we find the origin of this hatred. And Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all of his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Saul would not have imagined that his failure to comply completely with God's instructions would be playing out in this way so many generations later, as Haman sought his revenge and plotted to wipe out the Jews. So Haman convinced Xerxes that Jewish people posed a threat to the kingdom because they refused to obey the laws of the king. He also offered the king a bribe of 340 tons of silver, and whilst Xerxes refused to accept it, he did give Haman the royal seal, which allowed him the authority to make the decree that would eliminate the entire Jewish race. Esther chapter 3 verse 13 and 14 describe the order that Haman sent across the empire. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all of the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready to that day. Understandably, as the decree reached across the provinces, there was great mourning amongst the Jews. Mordecai, in a very public outpouring of grief, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and sat at the gate of the palace, weeping bitterly. When Esther heard of this, she was greatly distressed and sent Hathach, one of her attendants, to find out what was wrong. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king, to beg for mercy and to plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach, "Go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for all the Jews will come from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this." Perhaps. Something that I consider quite amazing in this story is that Esther never once gets a guarantee that everything is going to be okay. God does not give Esther or Mordecai clear or specific instructions as to what to do. But instead, he places them in positions where they have the opportunity to use the influence and wisdom that they already possess. In the same way, I believe God has placed each of us where we are, not only for our own benefit, but also for his purpose in the lives of others, and for his glory on earth. As Mordecai advises Esther, being in a position of power won't save her, and if she doesn't step up, someone else will. I find it so interesting that at this point, God seems to be completely silent, and yet, as we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the silhouette of his presence is clearly visible. For Esther and Mordecai, there does not appear to be any earth-shaking, miraculous intervention from God, yet, piece by piece, little things are falling into place that will make the salvation of his chosen people possible. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go and gather together all of the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Esther, after her initial hesitation, shows her courage and strength of character. She knows that this is a risk that she cannot take alone. So, in faith, she approaches God through prayer and fasting. Yet, at the same time, she is willing and ready to accept the consequences that may befall her. On the third day, Esther dressed in her finest clothes and entered the king's court. When he saw her, he held out his scepter, allowing her to approach the throne. "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And whilst they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favour with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you, and then I will explain what this is about." We aren't told whether or not Esther had planned to invite the king to a second banquet, but it was a wise move on multiple levels. Firstly, the king was curious. No one in their right mind would risk their life for a dinner party. Secondly, given she hadn't seen the king for a month, it was a way of re-establishing the relationship before making any requests. And thirdly, given Haman was highly favoured by Xerxes, it meant that the king saw her feasting Haman before she accused him. And it also gave Xerxes a chance to see Haman reveal his own character in light of these accusations. Haman was both boastful and proud at having had a private dinner with both the king and the queen, as well as being invited back the next day, and yet, as long as Mordecai was alive, he was not satisfied. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all of his friends suggested, "Set up a sharpened pole that stands 23 metres tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king." This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. During the night, the king couldn't sleep, so he ordered his attendants to read the chronicles of his reign, which apparently were quite boring because he was hoping they would send him back to sleep. In these records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the assassination plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who had guarded the door of the king's private quarters. And when the king realised that Mordecai had not been recognised for this, he decided to rectify it. At about this time, Haman, nice and early, arrived in the court ready to request that Mordecai be hung on his newly prepared gallows. "Bring him in," the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, "What should I do to honour a man who truly pleases me?" Haman, in his arrogance, thought to himself, "Who else would the king wish to honour more than me?" So he replied, "Well, if the king wishes to honour someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that that man, whom the king wishes to honour, is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse, and have the official shout as they go, 'This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honour.'" "Excellent," said the king. "Quick, take the robes and my horse, and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing, as you have suggested." So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, and placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for the man he wishes to honour." Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. And Haman's day was not about to get any better. At the banquet, when the king again asked Esther what her request was, Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favour with you, king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing my king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even insult the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signalling his doom. Haman was hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. King Xerxes gave to Esther all of the property that had previously belonged to Haman and elevated Mordecai to the position that Haman had held. For a second time, Esther, uninvited, went before the king, and when he again extended the golden scepter to her, she begged for the lives of her people. King Xerxes allowed Mordecai to send out another edict, which, whilst not cancelling out the first, allowed all of the Jews to gather together and defend themselves, to destroy and plunder all who tried to destroy them. When the day came, the Jews destroyed over 75,000 of their enemies. It's interesting to note that Haman's edict had called for the annihilation of all of the Jews, young and old, women and children. He wanted to see everyone with Jewish blood destroyed, even the innocent. In contrast, the Jews fought only with their enemies who tried to kill them, and they didn't touch the plunder even though they had the right to. This meant that the families of those men who were killed still retained their homes, land, and possessions. It was a merciful and wise thing to do. The Jews had a higher standard that God had given them. They were given freedom to harm and take what they wanted, but they refused to use the freedom in the wrong way. Esther's story is proof that faith can take many forms, and it is not linked to religious practice. Indeed, it would seem that throughout this book, God intentionally works outside of religious constructs or institutions. Esther's faith was quiet and conscientious. She blended in with her society to the point that no one knew her heritage, yet when a difficult situation arose, she chose to take a stand and be counted. Mordecai, on the other hand, was bold in his faith. In refusing to bow down to Haman, he literally stood out from the other people around him. He was eventually recognised for his integrity and elevated to a position of greater influence. Like Esther, we live in an occupied world which frequently throws us into scenarios in which we have little to no control over. In this multicultural melting pot, we too face challenges of differentiating between the world that we live in and our heritage and our identity as followers of Christ. No matter where we are in life's journey, or how visible our faith is to the people around us, at some point each and every one of us will, like Esther, be required to make a choice as to whether we will go before the rulers of this world, be they our bosses at work, lecturers, teachers, politicians, or other leaders, in order to stand up and be counted. Although it may be a scary prospect, for the majority of us, it is unlikely to be a life or death situation. Regardless, the story of Esther shows us that there is a power in faith and prayer. Even when God appears to be silent, he has promised and has demonstrated many times that he will be with us when we obey his commandments.